Welcome back to the channel. With all the craziness going on in the league this offseason, I wanted to revisit some of the biggest wide receiver trades in recent memory. Today, we will cover all those from the past and discuss how they turned out. Then look ahead to predict how the Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill trades will go. If you enjoy NFL content, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing. But now, let's get into it. I'll start by saying, I know I'm skipping over some trades, but I didn't want this video to turn into a half-hour documentary. I tried to choose a good mixture of good and bad results. The first trade we will look at is Terrell Owens from San Francisco to Philadelphia. The 49ers traded away their star, and some would say diva, wideout to the Eagles in 2003. They got compensation in the form of a second-round pick from Baltimore and defensive end Brandon Whiting. Prior to being traded, T.O. had a really good start to his career in San Fran. He had topped 1,100 yards 4 seasons in a row, averaging nearly 13 touchdowns per season. He was about to turn 31, so most would assume he's past his prime, and the 49ers thought he wasn't worth the headache in the locker room anymore. So he arrived in Philly with a chip on his shoulder, and the city loved him. His first season was a strong one. He missed 2 games, but ended the season with 77 catches for 1,200 yards and 14 touchdowns. Zero drop-off from his production in San Francisco. The following year, Owens turned up the drama and talked trash about his quarterback on the radio, got into a fistfight with a teammate on the team plane, and was suspended. He was later traded to Dallas, where he'd have several productive seasons, but to just discuss him being traded for the first time, I feel like you have to say Philadelphia got the bad end of the deal. Only 1 productive season and then a headache for the next year. Possibly the biggest wide receiver trade prior to this year's, and most surprising, was Randy Moss being traded from the Vikings to the Raiders. The Raiders gave up the number 7 overall pick, a 7th-round pick, and linebacker Napoleon Harris. Moss's situation was very similar to that of T.O.'s. He was considered a diva, but was also one of the top wide receivers in the game. The Vikings drafted him and then watched him accumulate record after record for the franchise, surpassing 1,600 yards in his best season with 17 touchdowns. But following the 2004 season, Vikings ownership knew they wanted to move on from Moss, so they traded him for as many assets as they could get from the Raiders. More similarity to T.O.'s situation, Moss would only be in Oakland for 2 seasons. 1 full season where he surpassed 1,000 yards, and 1 season where injury would sideline him for some games and his numbers would go down. They would end up trading him to the Patriots for a 4th-round pick the following offseason, and we all know where it went from there. Never trade with Bill Belichick. But for the Raiders, it wasn't a sweet deal at all. They gave up a very high draft pick and a role player for a league-average wide receiver for a year and a half, essentially. So far, 0 for 2 on being the first team to trade for a big-time wideout. Here comes another example of why not to trade with Bill Belichick. Dion was a Super Bowl MVP and Tom Brady's favorite receiver before announcing he'd be holding out for a new contract. That didn't fly with the Patriots head coach, so he was sent packing to Seattle for a first-round draft pick. Branch wasn't the same level of star as Moss and Owens from a statistical or personality standpoint, but he was tough, consistent, and came with a winning culture. He would hover around 800 to 900 yards per season in New England, only missing significant time in 1 season. One could, and should, in my opinion, argue that he wasn't worth a first-round pick to begin with, but that was the compensation. When he arrived in Seattle with high expectations, he quickly disappointed. In 4 full seasons, Branch never played more than 14 games, playing in just 8 one year, and never accumulated more than 725 yards or more than 4 touchdowns. Pedestrian numbers for the contract he received and the first-round pick given up to acquire him. 0 for 3 on teams trading for the receivers thus far. I'm going to skip over the OBJ trade and just remind you that it didn't work out for the Browns, so I can move on to a couple trades that have been good moves for the team making the acquisition. This brings us to DeAndre Hopkins being traded from Houston to Arizona. The details of the trade were Hopkins and a 4th to the Cardinals for David Johnson, a 2nd-round pick, and a 4th-round pick. So essentially, an often injured running back and a 2nd-round pick since they just swapped 4ths. To me, it's an absolute steal before you even know what Hopkins will do for you. In Houston, Hopkins averaged over 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns per season. He rarely missed time and was double-teamed every snap, which opens the rest of the field. When he arrived in Arizona, he had Larry Fitzgerald across from him and Kyler Murray at quarterback, so things seemed like it could improve. His first year, he went for 1,400 yards and 7 touchdowns. Didn't miss a beat. Last year, however, he missed 7 games due to injury. His first real missed time of his career. He still had 570 yards and 8 touchdowns in that time, though. I think it would be too early to say the Cardinals won the trade if they had given up significant draft capital. But for a 2nd-round pick and a running back, you will take this trade 100 times out of 100, even if he never plays another snap, in my opinion. But he'll be back next year and probably continue to do what he's done his entire career. The last trade to look at before addressing this offseason's moves is Stefon Diggs being traded from the Vikings to the Bills. Diggs, similar to other wide receivers on this list, was beginning to have some tension with his teammates and coaches, so rather than work through it, they decided to try and find a trade partner. The Vikings received 4 picks, including a first-round pick for Diggs. Diggs was a rising star. He hadn't been wide receiver one his entire career, but the duo of Diggs and Adam Thielen were becoming a big issue for other defenses. Diggs surpassed the 1,000-yard threshold 2 seasons in a row before the trade. He was only 26 at the time of the trade, which also increased his value. The Bills knew what they were doing with Diggs immediately, as he became one of the best wide receivers in the league by his statistics. In his 2 seasons with the Bills, he's averaged nearly 1,400 yards and 9 touchdowns. But before you can flat out call this a win for the Bills, you have to remember the Vikings turned that first-round pick into Justin Jefferson, who has averaged 1,500 yards and 8 touchdowns in the same amount of time. To me, it's an absolute win for both teams and the players. Everyone is satisfied, which is so rare for these NFL trades. So I'll call it 2-4 heading into these 2 most recent trades in favor of the team sending the player away. First, let's look at Davante Adams going to the Raiders. The trade is pretty straightforward. Adams to the Raiders for a first and second round pick. 3 out of his last 4 years, Adams has been an absolute monster, topping 1,300 yards each of those years, with last year going over 1,500. He also had an 18 touchdown year in 2020. A lot of that success can be attributed to Rodgers heavily targeting him, and Rodgers being a top 5 quarterback, possibly of all time. So, coming to Las Vegas, my expectations will be tempered, but I also think there are more weapons to take the heat off of Adams on the Raiders. Waller and Renfrow, plus Jacobs out of the backfield, are all legit targets for Derek Carr, who is no slouch at the quarterback position. Determining a winner of the trade will also depend on what the Packers get with the picks they've acquired. But to me, if Adams can average around 1,200 yards and hover around 8 to 12 touchdowns per year for at least 3 years, then the Raiders win this trade hands down, and I personally think he'll do that or better. Now, Tyreek Hill, which I think was a bigger shock to everyone as it all happened within about 2 hours. He was apparently unhappy with his contract, was given permission to seek a trade, and then chose Miami as his destination all in one afternoon. The Dolphins gave up a first, second, and fourth in this year's draft, plus a fourth and sixth next year. A larger compensation, which I would say is due to Hill being younger than Adams by 2 years. Hill has performed similarly to Adams over the last 4 years, surpassing 1,200 yards 3 times and hitting 15 touchdowns 1 time. So to me, for this to be a success for the Dolphins, he'll have to match the terms that I laid out for Adams. However, in this scenario, I just don't see it happening. I don't have faith in Tua. I'd love to be wrong, as the league is more fun when the Dolphins are good. But for Hill to do what he does, he's going to have to get good, accurate, deep shots thrown his way and get schemed into the short game. It could happen, but I'm not nearly as confident as I am with the Raiders. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens over the next couple seasons. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I'll see y'all next time.